Sherry, welcome to A House for Arts. It's such a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I understand, Sherry, that as a professor and as a scholar, you write articles about Chinese art. In particular, you do research on ancient burials and tombs. Am I right about that?
Yes.
What have you found inside these tombs? How old are they?
Well, the ancient Chinese filled their tombs with so many different things. The period that I study is called the Han Dynasty, and it lasted from 206 BCE to 220 CE, or AD. So about
That's
400
over 400 years.
400 years.
Wow.
And it was around this time that the Chinese started to believe in the concept of an afterlife. So they filled their tombs with all kinds of different things. They had a lot of unanswered questions, of course, so they sort of answered them materially in their tombs. They would have items of protection, items of travel, certainly comfort items and items of status.
So you mean to say, Sherry, that these are questions they didn't know about, like what happens in the afterlife, or where do you go, or do you live the way that you do, like in your life? I don't know what other term to use to describe it.
Yeah, they set up their tombs. Some of them looked like houses. They had architectural features. Some of them had a lot of paraphernalia for travel. So there seemed to be a lot of different conceptions of what the afterlife held. But most people believe that they did believe that the soul continued to live and that it needed most of what it had in life in order to enjoy the kind of life it had already had.
Like what? What are some of the favorite things you've ever found before that people would have used in life and then they need them in their tomb?
Well, there's a lot of spectacular items that the Han Dynasty is famous for, like large suits of jade made from thousands of little finely carved jade pieces. That was for royalty. And also,
I can imagine.
Also beautiful silk paintings. But the thing that I've always been interested in since my dissertation work, they're the more mundane things that people place in tombs that give us a sense of the more day-to-day lives of the early Chinese.
Because I understand that you focus on toiletries, right? Like the things that people use to beautify themselves or in their toilet or their bathroom. So I'm curious to know, what do these toiletries reveal about people's private lives from thousands of years ago? Because I think when you're talking about the jade suits and the silks, you think about patronage and royalty, and you think about like the kind of public persona. But when we're thinking about toiletries, it almost sounds like you're seeing another facet of people's lives. Yeah. Were these private lives anything like ours today?
I think they were similar. If you look at what's in the boxes, so they're rounded boxes filled with mirrors and combs, but the more well-preserved ones might include eyebrow pens and tweezers, cosmetic powders, powder puffs, even hair extensions.
Wow, so eyebrows were a big thing then, even before the whole Instagram craze with eyebrows.
Oh, indeed. They completely clipped out their entire eyebrow and then colored it in. So they had many different styles, different trends throughout the period.
It sounds like by looking at these types of items, like these combs and eyebrow pencils and things, you can learn something about conceptions of beauty at the time.
Yes.
And ideals of beauty. Are there other types of things that these toiletries reveal to us that people may not know about the quote-unquote Orient? So for instance, does it reveal something about like the culture and politics of the Han Dynasty or of that period?
Yeah, one thing I found was that males in ancient China used cosmetics. And it's really interesting because there have been some recent discoveries that actually push that phenomenon back a couple hundred years before my period, where they found tombs with little bronze vessels that have residue of cosmetic powders at the bottom. And interdisciplinary studies are allowing them to learn these kinds of things.
And by interdisciplinary studies, do you mean like studies that incorporate like methods from art history, methods from archaeology or anthropology? Is that what you mean by that, Sherry?
Yeah, I mean that the archaeologists are unearthing these things, and then the scientists are taking over to actually analyze the contents of those residues.
And so like to date them it's organic material, right? Yeah. That's incredible. So it's as if we are also learning too that men's understanding of how to look and how to be beautiful were very different than thousands of years ago in China than maybe they are today in the United States.
Perhaps.
Right? Imagine even today, even in China.
Perhaps, yeah. I think, like today, I think there's a range of people out there. And I think certainly elite men used cosmetics. There was an ideal of clean, clear white skin socially for men and women. And it was also a political ideal to have clear skin as a man. And men also had to lavish attention on their hair, particularly their facial hair. Beards were a symbol of masculinity and virility. These were also political ideals.
Wow.
So I think it's interesting that the boxes can tell us stories, much more complex stories than we would ever have expected.
Right. I'm curious to know, Sherry, how did you first get interested in studying Chinese art and these burials and tombs? Did you go and travel to China before you went to graduate school?
I did. I feel very lucky that I've kind of always known what I wanted to do. I've always wanted to do what I do today. Back in high school, I already knew I was going to study art history. I also already loved all things Asian. And I think this is partly because we didn't really learn about these things. We certainly didn't have art history in high school. And history classes were dominated by the Euro-American tradition.
Right.
And I also grew up in the suburbs of Chicago and would sneak to Chinatown every time I could. So that also helped.
Yeah.
Then when I got to college, I started studying the language. And I did have the privilege to travel to China as an undergrad, both China and Taiwan, for language study and also for a little bit of thesis research.
Right, so you landed there speaking Mandarin.
I did.
Yeah, that's amazing. Do you have any like particular stories from your time like going and studying there that were like just really stick out to you or really crazy memories?
I mean, just all of the experiences of being like a teenager in China. I mean, I was 18 or 19, but still, I was a teenager. And some of my research trips would take me to smaller cities. And on the streets of those cities, this was 20 years ago, on the streets of those cities, people would stop at that time and stare and say foreigner. And I would be
That's awkward.
pretty shocked, very uncomfortable, a little scared. But I quickly realized that if I just continued to be my American friendly self and said hello in Chinese, that they immediately turned warm and they had a smile and they were so delighted to speak with me. And I made lots of random friends.
Amazing. That sounds like such a valuable experience for you.
Yeah.
And you can bring a lot of insight too, because I was curious to know, I want to come back to that, actually, some of your cultural experiences and the insight you can bring. But I was really fascinated because I looked online for Chinese antiquities and I found these websites that sell ancient Chinese vessels, like a Neolithic vessel from 2500 BCE for like $700. And I'm wondering, what do you think of these websites, Sherry? I mean, who is buying and selling these Neolithic vessels? I mean, are these pieces being looted? What's going on with that?
I think that a lot of what you see on those sites, particularly the unofficial ones, are really good fakes. But there are some authentic items being sold, and they would be very likely looted from Chinese tombs. And that is a real tragedy. You'll notice that the sellers of those sites are anonymous. The buyers are often, they have the option of being anonymous.
Right.
And all of this contributes to the continuation of an illicit market in antiquities and the continued plunder of Chinese archaeological sites.
Right, and I imagine the internet with all of its anonymity helps to drive this even more. And I also understand too, I was doing some research, it sounds like the Chinese government's also signing bilateral agreements with some countries to help repatriate or bring back some of these looted antiquities. I know like the US and Australia house some of the most amount or the largest number of buyers of these Chinese antiquities. So it sounds like this is a really pressing issue on a political level.
Yeah. I think those bilateral agreements are really important because they acknowledge the respect for antiquities from both countries, right? The US acknowledges that these are part of the patronage of China, and China recognizes that it must protect its cultural heritage.
Absolutely. I kind of want to bring us forward then in time, speaking about politics, and also tie back into that insight that you're bringing when you had these cultural experiences when you were younger, and I'd imagine you'd been going back before the pandemic to China. You know, when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out and then it started spreading to the US, there was a lot of talk in the news about how the virus apparently originated in China. And even though we don't know the exact geographic origins of this virus, in actuality, a lot of Chinese living in the United States or Chinese Americans were dealing with racial discrimination and people were blaming them for the spread of the virus. Even other Asian Americans who would just be lumped together, confused with the Chinese, would have to deal with this sort of scapegoating. And I'm kind of curious to know, what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that many Americans may have about China and the Chinese, or about Chinese politics or culture or history?
That's a very big question, a very good question. I think it is an important question to think about. And I can give two examples, one being my own experience. My impressions from travel to China have been a lasting memory of the very honorable way that I'm always treated as a foreigner and as a guest in their country. The Chinese are extremely hospitable and generous, extremely generous. It's part of their culture, it's ingrained in their culture to have the highest regard for a guest. And I don't know if Americans today extend those same courtesies to foreigners on our soil, especially those who are from vastly different cultures, who look different, who eat different foods.
Even speaking with an accent sometimes will get you a little bit of negative attention here in the States. You know, sometimes people think you're not as smart because you speak with an accent, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the other thing would be, regarding those misconceptions, I think that extends, it's sort of what you said within your question, it extends beyond the Chinese themselves to Asians, that there are Asians living here in the US who are from a multitude of Asian countries and cultures. There are Americans here who are of Asian heritage, and they all get lumped together as one group. Yeah. So I think it's really important that we have a curiosity about those cultures, that we learn about them, that we explore their individual experiences, that we understand where they came from, and then maybe we can start to not make the mistakes that some people make today.
Yeah, absolutely a lot of great food for thought. Sherry, thank you so much for being on the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much.